Record.
Well done.
Yeah.
Right, try again, Judy.
Right. We think that John had the sense of having been bullied as a child, to use a modern phrase. Obviously, there wasn't such an expression then. Picked on and scorned by possibly his mother and certainly his older brothers. And so when he went to Ireland, possibly subconsciously, he wanted to get his own back. And so he laughed at, very inappropriately, laughed at the Irish chieftains because they had big beards, which they didn't comb very regularly, rather wild hair, which equally they didn't comb very regularly. And they wore what seemed to be very primitive clothes. And he openly laughed at them and mocked them, which was a ridiculous thing to do. So again, psychologically, he was probably, like people who have got an inferiority complex, trying to show who was boss, and it caused enormous offence. It was a ridiculous thing to have done, considering he was intelligent. And he was actually laughing in their faces. He wasn't just laughing behind their backs. That would have been bad enough, but he was laughing at them with people watching, with witnesses. So the whole situation was a disaster. He also proved to be unreliable, disloyal, a disloyal son, a disloyal brother, as we know. He turned against his father, and then he turned against his own brother. So he's sort of establishing himself as a dodgy character, an unreliable character, at a time when loyalty was key. Loyalty was an incredibly important aspect of the feudal system. You were willing to die for your overlord. The whole system was based on loyalty, duty, obligation, etc. He was proving himself to be a loose cannon. Appearance probably didn't help. Again, probably fed into this feeling he had of inferiority. We can feel quite sorry for him. He had this tall, handsome, attractive brother, unusually tall. Richard the First was over 6 foot, possibly 6'4", which was enormous for those days, and handsome. And he was a sort of sporty character. He looked fine on horseback. He looked fine when he wasn't on a horse. He got lovely coloured hair, the colour of ripe corn, somebody described it as. Fair skin, very much like young Henry VIII. Popular just by looking attractive, because we haven't changed since our ancestors were alive. People, we shouldn't be, but we are influenced by looks. Just think of the way people responded to Princess Diana. People are influenced. They might feel a bit ashamed of it, but it's just built in. And Richard I looked at the picture of a king. Tall, handsome, probably had an attractive smile. John, only 5'6" tall, stockily built, and described as ugly and dark. So people described him as ugly. Contemporaries described him as ugly. So this is a recipe for resentment and sort of wanted to get his own back on life itself. He felt inferior. And people who feel like that are actually can be quite dangerous. They're constantly trying to make up for something they feel they've missed out on. But John was definitely his father's favourite, so he spoiled and indulged his son. So we've got a pretty toxic mix here of a child who is being sort of psychologically damaged. So turning to his accession, even this wasn't straightforward. There was a rival. The succession was not assured. One by one, his brothers had all died. John, very, very much the spare, baby of the family, finally, last brother standing. But it wasn't a clear-cut succession, because when Richard died unexpectedly in 1199, the heir apparently was Prince Arthur of Brittany, the son of one of the princes who died, who was much obviously much older. Older brother Geoffrey had left a son, Prince Arthur of Brittany, and King Henry II had actually named him as his heir. John was regarded as disloyal, self-absorbed, incompetent, and therefore not suitable monarch material. So again, an enormous snub, which wouldn't have helped him psychologically at all. But he acted very quickly, and there's a sort of pattern here with William Rufus and other kings, and Henry I, who didn't think that they were going to be nominated as king unless they acted quickly. So the main thing was to capture the royal treasure. So that's a pattern as well. Whiz off to wherever the royal treasure is, the crown jewels and the royal, the mint, and where the treasure was kept. It was kept at Chinon. And he attacked Le Mans in Normandy, because Normandy was supporting Arthur's claim. John obtained the support of William Marshal in England and Geoffrey Fitzpeter, Earl of Essex, who was the Chief Justice, and they quickly arranged John's coronation. So it wasn't a done deal. Even that was a bit dodgy. It wasn't a straightforward situation at all. And John's right to succeed was constantly questioned because of Arthur of Brittany, who hadn't blotted his copybook, as John had done, and was seen as a safer pair of hands. On the other hand, he was young, and there was always this problem when the rivals, and one was very young, much younger than the other, an adult would surely guard this country rather than a teenager. So this goes right back to Saxon times, when you have an argument about who would make a suitable king, a youngster or an experienced older person. Well, the older person was John, but his right to the throne was questioned. So that wasn't good for him either, psychologically, that he hadn't got a straightforward, he hadn't come to the throne acclaimed by everybody, as his brother Richard had done. So looking at John's reputation as an evil monarch, because he has gone down in history as the worst king we've ever had. We've never had another king called John. Nobody wanted to be named, nobody wanted to call their child John in the royal family until there was a Prince John. You probably remember there was a programme, The Lost Prince, the child of Edward VII and Queen Alexandra. They had a son called John who was epileptic, who was hidden away, Prince John, and then died when I think he was 13. He was only a youngster, the Lost Prince, because it wasn't a popular name. I mean, it's a lovely name, but it wasn't popular in the royal family because of King John and his reputation. So how much does he deserve this awful reputation? Well, first of all, he had proved himself disloyal to both his father and his brother prior to succession. And I've just said, according to the feudal system and the old Saxon idea of loyalty, you would die for your lord. Disloyalty was like murder. It was appalling. It was the most awful thing to be proved to be disloyal. Disregard for the Irish nobility, like he lacked judgment. Doesn't make him evil, but it makes him an idiot, twit. Not very bright. In fact, he was bright, but he behaved very badly in Ireland. So another bad mark. Stealing a betrothed wife of an influential nobleman. This was his second wife, also called Isabella. First wife was called Isabella. They had no children. And she was actually quite sort of related to him, the first queen, Isabella. Well, she wasn't queen. The second Isabella The claim was that she was betrothed to somebody called Hugh Lusignan, using the French. My French is very good. That John saw her when she was a teenager, fell madly in love with her, and although she was betrothed, which was a contract to marry later, although she was betrothed, he sort of snatched her, virtually kidnapped her, and married her and made her his queen. She was called Isabella of Angoulême. How far is that true? Apparently not really true at all. There's even an argument about how old they were when they met, that she wasn't a teenager, because there's this sort of inference that somehow he'd done something perverted, which is ridiculous, because people in those days, there wasn't a marriageable age fixed by law. Girls and young men could get married as soon as they were mature, as soon as nature said they were adult. So it could vary. It could vary by several years. So there wasn't a fixed age at which people could get married. So there isn't even any, we don't even know when John first saw the young lady that he later married, Isabella of Angoulême. It says there is no basis for this legend. Isabel, I'm reading now, Isabel is variously estimated to have been 11, 12, 13, or 14 at the times, obviously, because it's so lacking in detail, in accuracy. It sounds like a legend. It sounds that this is something that's been made up. Another aspect of John's evil reputation, to sort of say, well, he stole somebody else's affianced bride. He broke a contract. He's totally untrustworthy, and he's a bit of a pervert because she was a child. Well, the whole thing is ridiculous, because even if she was only, well, maybe if she was 11, if she was 12, a lot of marriages took place where the girl was well grown and physically an adult. We found that rather dreadful, but they didn't. So there is something very fishy about this story that he stole somebody else's bride. It says John had plenty of mistresses. It is highly unlikely that he fell in love so opportunely with this particular child. But in doing so, he had offended a very important French noble family. That is certainly true, but not to the extent that his enemies claimed. He had offended this family, but they made friends and sort of shook hands later. Not literally, but they made friends. So that wasn't as awful as it was made out to be. Lechery. Yes, he did have numerous mistresses, usually married women, and so did most of the rest of the family, apart from Richard I. You know, standard. Again, we might appear shocked. And of course, the Victorians, in their sort of piety, made much of this. What an evil man, and all these mistresses. Well, some of their favorite, not Richard I, but some of their favorite monarchs also had lots of mistresses. It was sort of accepted as a sort of manly thing to do. People weren't shocked and horrified. They were a bit suspicious if somebody didn't have lots of mistresses. So,
and married women.
well, they were married, so if they had a baby, they couldn't sort of say it wasn't a sort of stray illegitimate child, like, you know, Henry I with his 25 illegitimate offspring. It was so he didn't have to pay for them. Because in those days there was no DNA, so you couldn't prove who a child belonged to. So if a woman was married and got pregnant,
Good luck,
the husband had to take responsibility for it. Imposition of increased taxes, fines, tolls, rates. That was true. It alienated rich subjects. Didn't make him evil. Made him more popular. It doesn't make King John an evil monarch. And when you think about how much money Richard I had managed to get from his subjects, our ancestors, you know, the mind boggles that King John is being blamed and criticised when it was nothing like to the same extent. But of course, if it was for the crusade, then it was holy money, it was special. And when our ancestors paid their extra taxes to Richard I, they were thinking, I will get a special dispensation to go to heaven because I'm giving money to the crusade. I'm not just giving money to a greedy king. Well, I mean, Richard I wasn't greedy, but he took huge amounts of money, extra taxation, which usually made kings very unpopular. And of course, because it was for the crusade, he was forgiven, not just forgiven, but congratulated. He was so determined to go to the Holy Land, rescue Jerusalem. Tyrannical threats leading to imprisonment if extra revenue was not forthcoming. Yes, guilty as charged. John did indeed do that. Not all on his own, though. He had advice. If people don't pay, then they should be punished. And there was certainly corruption, money, getting money through menaces. These were rich people, not poor people. It was seen as unworthy of a monarch to be sort of going around threatening. He sort of was threatening people, but he was saying, you know, the taxes have gone up. If you don't pay, then you'll be punished as a traitor. There's not anything really dreadful about that. He was just making sure that they paid up. Illegally keeping money intended for wards and widows. Yes, guilty as charged. He did actually do this. So did other monarchs. Wards were people who were underage when they became an heir or an heiress. And so somebody had to look after their finances. It was like having power of attorney. And it was a sacred trust to look after that child's finances. And when they were of age, hand over whatever it was, their estates, their stately home, their palaces, their castles, whatever, in good order, because you had managed their finances during their minority. And John did milk the system. He took money which he wasn't entitled to during those years of minority, or went on saying that they were incapable of looking after their own affairs when they'd actually come of age. He would say that they lacked mental capacity, or, you know, he was a bit of a rogue when it came to wards and widows. Widows were in the same position. They needed a male advisor and somebody with the equivalent of power of attorney. Yes, he had done that. Doesn't make him totally evil, because other kings have done much the same. Cruelty. He was accused of starving people. This is another punishment. Starving people to death because they'd been accused of treason. And that was an illegal form of punishment. The jury's out on that. There was evidence that people had been locked in rooms and not given any food, and they died of hunger. But not necessarily, it wasn't necessarily the king that had ordered this to happen. It did happen, but you can't pin it actually on the king. But what was gradually happening was that anything, it was almost like anything that went wrong was attributed to King John. The murder of his nephew. Well, again, this was sort of accepted as, you know, he was a horrible person, so he probably did murder his nephew Arthur, who sort of disappeared. So again, I'm going to read a little bit. It says the story is so again, people are sort of judging John by Shakespeare's play, King John. It says the widely accepted story of Arthur's fate, which differs from that portrayed in Shakespeare's play, is exceedingly dramatic, though it depends upon how much credibility can be attached to accounts recorded by monastic chroniclers writing well after the event. So, two things there. Monastic chroniclers were very prejudiced against John for reasons we'll come to. They dipped their pens in vitriol when they wrote about him. They went over the top in denouncing him and saying that he had come straight from hell to be King of England, and he would go straight back to hell when he died. And anything that was negative, they attributed to John. So they are very unreliable. In other words, they're telling lies. they are libeling the king. And the other thing, they were writing well after the event, which obviously we can understand is an issue. They weren't writing as soon as it had happened, with or even finding fresh evidence. They were writing a long time afterwards when things couldn't be proved. So the story is first that John was persuaded that his nephew should be blinded and castrated, which makes us feel quite sick. But that was standard, unfortunately, in many countries. Blinded meant that they would be useless as king. Castrated meant that they wouldn't be able to produce an heir who would continue the challenge and the conflict about who should succeed to the throne of whichever country it was. To us, this seems absolutely barbaric and savage and dreadful, blinding and castrating. But in those days, it wasn't regarded as quite as dreadful, and it had a practical purpose. But that the order which he gave that this should be done was disobeyed by Hubert de Burgh, the baron who had charge of Arthur in Falaise. And Falaise, if you remember, was where in Normandy was where William the Conqueror had been born and brought up. So rather a special place. Subsequently, Arthur, it is said, was removed to Rouen, the capital of Normandy, and there on the 3rd of April 1203 was put to death. A monastic chronicler in the Cistercian Abbey of Marham in Glamorgan gives a circumstantial description of Arthur of Brittany's end. So this is a quote from one of these aforesaid chroniclers. After King John had captured Arthur and kept him alive in prison for some time, at length in the castle of Rouen, after dinner on the Thursday before Easter, when he was drunk and possessed by the devil, he slew him with his own hand, and tying a heavy stone to the body, cast it into the Seine, the river. It was discovered by a fisherman in his net, and being dragged to the bank and recognized, was taken for secret burial. All very dramatic and totally accepted at the time. But there are, I'm sure, as I read it, you can see flaws in this description. Who witnessed this? How can, it's very specific. The Thursday after dinner on the Thursday before Easter. There's something rather suspicious about that. It's written a long time afterwards. And that the king had killed his nephew with his own hands. That is specified. With his own hand. He was a murderer. He was evil. Totally, totally evil. And then he disposed of the body. He had the foresight to tie a heavy stone to him and throw him in the river. And then luckily, a fisherman caught him in his net. I mean, it doesn't sound very, very convincing, but people totally believed it. This is the main reason for crediting this tale is that William de Braose, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, who had actually taken Arthur prisoner, is known to have been a patron of the Margam monastery, and might have been aware of what had happened and told it to the monks. It can also be argued that the story is too elaborate to have been made up. Yes, you could argue that. The detail, you could say, oh, fantastic, there's such detail, must have happened like that. A reference in a letter written by John to his mother and others on the 16th of April 1203, in which he says that God's grace has stood him in better stead than he could possibly indicate, has been interpreted to refer to the death of Arthur on the 3rd of April. Another chronicler, writing after John's death, recorded that Arthur had been, quote, shamefully murdered. But a statement that the French court solemnly condemned John for murdering his nephew has never been fully substantiated. Other people have said, oh, this account is very convincing, and other people saying absolutely the opposite. And that there is evidence that Arthur died of an infection. He died a natural death. So all this is, well, not sort of scapegoating, but just another nail in King John's coffin. Let's accuse him of having murdered his nephew, or castrated and blinded him. There are all sorts of variations on this theme, that he was castrated and blinded and then killed. and they just seem more and more unlikely. The next one is true. Disastrous loss of lands interpreted as God's curse on an evil king. Our ancestors were very superstitious. They believed that God punished not in the next life, but in this life. And so when John started to lose large lumps of his inheritance, that was seen as, God is not mocked. God is punishing him. Therefore, he must have done all these bad things that we've heard about. That's proof positive. Losing land, God's punishment. It was true that but it would have happened to any king. It's happening to Richard I. That's why he spent so much time away from this country. He certainly wasn't in the Holy Land all that time. He was fighting vigorously in France to maintain the Angevin Empire and not succeeding. Disastrous quarrel with the English clergy and the Pope. Yes, of course, that happened. And therefore, again, it was because John was such a terrible, awful king. And quarrel with his nobles leading to Magna Carta. Yes, of course, that's true. But it was happening. That was just something that was happening throughout that period. That the barons were fighting for more power and sort of ganging up on the king. It had happened in the reign of Henry II and Henry I, and even the Conqueror over mighty subjects. Right, John's actions as a good monarch. Tried to get the balance right, which historians in the past didn't even try to do. They just condemned him without inquiring too deeply into the evidence. Claims that John was irreligious, greatly exaggerated. He did found religious establishments. He went to mass regularly, possibly not with great enthusiasm. He confessed his sins. He did penance for his sins. And he had a great admiration for a role model called St. Wulstan of Worcester, which is why he's buried in Worcester Cathedral. That was his wish. So if he was so irreligious, how come he did all the things I've just said? His second marriage to Isabella of Angoulême, he hadn't stolen her. The marriage made a great deal of sense. His first marriage was childless. He managed to divorce or annul his marriage very easily because she was a cousin and they hadn't actually had permission from the Pope to marry with consanguinity, it's called. They were closely related, therefore it was easy to end his marriage, unlike poor Henry VIII, who found it incredibly difficult to end his first marriage. The second marriage was very, very convenient, did this country good. He gained much land. She was an heiress. And it isn't really important that the Lusignan family were offended because the king made friends with them later. So that's something that was pinned on him that he doesn't deserve. Lechery, not exceptional or unusual at the time. John needed revenue. His demands were not exorbitant or extortionate compared with his predecessors. We already dealt with that. King John, there's no doubt about this, King John was a caring king of England. We have the itineraries to prove it, actual evidence, not like all these rumours and slanders and libels all swirling around him. We have proof that he was an excellent king of England from the point of view of checking his realm, more than Richard I had ever done. He rode the length and breadth of the country, administering justice, punishing bad practice, rooting out corruption. So 10 out of 10 of the gold star for being a caring, concerned king and caring about his subjects and what was going on in what we might say the provinces. I mean, some kings, even as late as Stuart times, just stayed in the home counties. They never did very much travelling. John did. He established many boroughs. This was good. This was to help the economy, granting charters and market rights. And two famous ones, Liverpool, granted borough status and the right to hold markets. I mean, but it's a port as well, obviously. And Barnsley, When I learned that, my family are from Barnsley, I was rather taken aback that their market rights were granted by, and the borough, granted by King John. And that created prosperity in a wide area. And that was a good thing to do. But that's sort of boring for the chroniclers. Not as exciting as killing his nephew with his own hands and then weighting the body down and throwing it in the river. You know, it's not even today, you know, listening to the news, we perhaps sort of our minds switch off a little bit when it's about the economy or the Bank of England having done something. I know mine does. Mine sort of goes a bit walkabout. And then a bit of royal gossip, and we sort of perk up a bit because not because we've got trivial minds, it's just the way we are, that we rather enjoy a bit of drama every so often, something a bit spectacular, something a bit different. And our ancestors were no different. It's just that modern historians dig deep. They try and get evidence. They try and get hold of something specific to prove what is being alleged. And poor John doesn't get any credit for all these good things that he did. He maintained good law and order. You know, to get praise for that. That mattered to our ancestors. Very much indeed, on a local level. You could say that he was very good when it came to local government. He overhauled the financial system and increased efficiency. Again, that doesn't sort of fill people with great excitement even today. All of these achievements, even if they had been flagged up, as I've just done, even if they'd been flagged up at the time, would have been cancelled out by the fact that he made a huge mistake by getting into dispute with the church and then the Pope. That was a really bad idea. Really bad idea. So like the exact opposite of his brother, his magnificent, fancy, you know, fantastic, handsome brother that went off to fight in the Holy Land. Very much 10 out of 10 gold star. What did John do? Quarrelled with the Pope. And the country ended up being placed under an interdict. And John himself being excommunicated, which was the most awful thing that could possibly have happened to the country and to him. So without going into great detail, John did not want Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury. He was a great theologian. He was a strong character, Stephen Langton, favoured by the Pope, who also had a very strong character. He was one of the sort of outstanding popes of the Middle Ages, Innocent III. You know, there are good popes and bad popes and lazy popes and very formidable. He was one of the formidable popes. Made a real name for himself. In 1207, Innocent III consecrated Langton. The king refused to grant a permit for him to land in England. So he defied the Pope, which is a really bad idea. But again, back to this lack of self-esteem, inferiority complex. You know, Sigmund Freud invented this idea of somebody having an inferiority complex, but behaving in a very superior way, getting into arguments with people, wanting their own way, not willing to sort of submit or compromise because inside they feel inferior. It does actually fit with John's personality. So that kind of arm wrestling, you know, again, lack of judgment, certainly lack of judgment. Did he really think he could win in a contest with the Pope? And in 1208, the Pope laid an interdict on England and Wales. This was incredibly serious. No church services, no sacraments offered. People's souls in danger. Our ancestors spent a lot of their waking hours worrying about their soul's salvation. Maybe hard for us to think like that today, but many hours of every day thinking about when they died. I mean, they died much younger than we expect to do. They died sometimes in their 30s or 40s. So, you know, they were sensible to start thinking about death when they were still quite young. where would their soul go? Where would they go for eternity? People believed that there was another life, but where would it be? Would it be in purgatory? Would it be in hell? Would it be in heaven? And if you couldn't have the sacraments, then people's souls would not be saved and they would go to hell. I mean, this is a really, really terrible thing to have happened. And John remains stubborn, as people often do when they have this kind of inferiority complex. They can't give in because they feel that that makes them weak. They've been teased about being weak, and so they can't give in. They become very stubborn, very obstinate, very determined, but in a foolish sort of way. They're either in a dispute which they know ultimately they can't win, or it's causing terrible damage, but they still won't give in. So when the Pope excommunicated the king, that meant his soul would go to hell when he died. The king didn't seem to be very concerned, at which point people started to say, they didn't do a psychological analysis of him. They said, he is from the devil. He's not behaving in a normal way. He should be absolutely contrite and in tears and terrified. He seems to be all, so what, so what, the Pope has excommunicated me, I don't care. That was when the rumour started that he was from hell, he was from the devil, he was the devil's child. Not only did he not seem very bothered, he used it as an excuse to help himself to church revenues. He saw it as an advantage, as an opportunity to help himself to church money. So, a sort of double whammy. And then some years later, 3 years after he'd been excommunicated, he discovered, first of all, a baronial plot, and that the King of France was planning to invade England. So, a bit of a wake-up call for John. Things are getting really serious. He can't sort of brush this off. And he realises that things have become very serious. May 2013, a controversial decision. King John offered the realm of England to the Pope as a fief. In other words, asked the Pope to become our feudal overlord, which is very dramatic, because now he's realised he's got to get on the right side of the Pope and quickly. So incredibly dramatic decision. Have England, as a papal province. The Pope in those days had land in Italy. So this wasn't a very unusual thing to offer him some land, but he was trying to get back in with the Pope, so to make friends with him. And he paid homage to the Pope, became his vassal. So this is incredibly unusual. And it worked. The Pope lifted the excommunication and the interdict, and then said, it was like, became best friends with King John, willing to support King John in his conflict with King Philip of France, who was slowly but surely taking more and more of our Angevin land, not just nibbling at it, but taking chunks of it. That was true right through this period of the King of France taking the land which Eleanor of Aquitaine had brought to the crown. And Anjou, the empire was gradually being taken. So this conflict with the Pope was massively important in determining whether King John was a good king or a bad king, or whether he was from God or whether he was from the devil. And the jury decided he was from the devil, even though he's now best friends with the Pope. Loss of French territory, we've already said, that was seen as a punishment, that little by little, our great empire, and at one stage we owned far more, well, we had more French territory, not exactly owned, but had authority over more of France than the King of France, because of Eleanor of Aquitaine's enormous territory in southwest France. And we'd already got Normandy, and we'd already got Anjou, so we were, it was a kind of ridiculous situation, really. And little by little it was being eroded, being taken, and these Angevin kings spent an awful lot of time in France fighting. So 1213, English success, destruction of the French invasion fleet at Bruges. the King of England, sorry, the King of France was aiming to conquer this country. It was going to be the Norman Conquest, part 2. 1214, complete reversal. French army led by the king himself. Battle of Bouvines. We keep very quiet about this. You know, we talk about Agincourt, we talk about Poitiers and Crécy. We don't talk about Bouvines because it was an absolutely horrible, disastrous defeat for the English army and a triumphant victory for the French. Utter humiliation for us. We got an Anglo-Flemish-German army. And so we got allies, but horribly defeated. Beginning of the end, really. I'm sure you remember that by the Tudor period, all we had left of our great empire in France was the 20-mile radius around Calais. That was all that was left. It had all been taken through battle or marriage, but mainly through battle, the 100 Years' War. So King John is seen as a complete loser, a failure, useless as a king, as a monarch with land. He'd lost so much of land. He lost Normandy. He'd lost enormous amounts of land. So that, and the conflict with the Pope, and all these other allegations made against him, created this impression that he wasn't just a loser, he was cursed. And people who were cursed obviously were working for the devil. And so there were all these stories about that he had come from hell and was going back to hell. So what we've left out, of course, is Magna Carta, which is another defeat for the king, if you like. And something quite unimportant in one way, but very, very symbolic, losing the crown jewels in the wash, which has led to lots of cartoons of Prince John washing his socks and washing various things by the seaside, and the crown jewels being swept away in the wash and disappearing forever in the mud, just sort of sinking, or that he was washing his crown and it all got washed away. And when I was little, I actually thought that had happened, that the king had lost the crown jewels in the wash. They didn't know what the wash was. Yeah, sort of bit of inland, well, not inland sea, but we spent many happy holidays at Hunstanton, which is, I'm sure you know, the only resort in this country that faces due west, even though it's in the East Anglia. It's on the wash. Lovely, safe area for children to paddle. They can paddle for miles because the sea is so shallow, and massive beaches. When the tide goes out, you can hardly see the sea. So a huge beach appears. So yeah, John losing his crown jewels in the wash was proof positive to our ancestors that he was working for the devil, or the devil was working through John.
Trudy,
So,
two observations. It strikes me that it would be very interesting to hear how French people were taught this period of history and what sort of slant they had,
yes,
they would receive on it. And yet again,
yeah,
full stop, fresh paragraph, yet again, I'm reminded of how fascinating it would be to get access to the Pope's files going back to.
Yes. What did he think of King John of England? Yes.
Well, the letters that they've got there and all the papers that they've squirreled away.
Well, yes, because the Vatican archives are some of the best in the world. And I'm sure you know.
I couldn't find the word archive, you see, but yes.
But the archives are absolutely fantastic.
But they're secret.
And scrupulously kept
Yeah.
in good order. Well, I'm sure you know that the 17 love letters that King Henry VIII wrote to Anne Boleyn are in the Vatican. They were stolen.
I didn't know that.
No, they're stolen as evidence when the king was taking his first wife, virtually taking the marriage to court. They had an actual court case where the marriage to Catherine of Aragon was investigated on the you know, as canon law. And both appeared in court. The king appeared and Queen Catherine appeared and spoke about the marriage. And during that period, the 17 love letters that the king had written to Anne Boleyn were stolen from Anne Boleyn's home and appeared in the Vatican as proof that the king was actually two-timing his lovely sainted first wife, just to make sure that the Pope didn't give in and say, yes, of course you can have an annulment of your marriage, you know, to show that the king was up to no good with another woman, was an adulterer, although he wasn't at that point. So how humiliated King Henry VIII would be if he knew that his very personal, private love letters were in a glass case in the Vatican Library, available for anybody to read and look at. Imagine how humiliated he would be, how mortified he would be. All his private thoughts about Anne Boleyn. And so the Vatican archives are very, very, very scrupulous. So yes, it would be very interesting to see. We'll see if we can find out. That could be homework, holiday homework. What, if we know whether I mean, the archives will exist, what the situation was regarding King John, at what point Innocent III decided that he was going to take this dramatic, but make this dramatic move of putting the whole country, a sort of curse, well, it was like a papal, not curse exactly, but withdrawing the Catholic Church's approval of the whole country, all our ancestors, unable to have their children, their babies christened, unable to get married in church, unable to have a church funeral. Totally dramatic. And therefore, our ancestors would have felt that they were doomed when they died to go to hell, or to live, or to live for thousands and thousands of years in purgatory, being punished for their sins. And then when the king was excommunicated on top of that, that was seen as extreme. Henry VIII was excommunicated, and so was Elizabeth I. So very, very dramatic. So we're left thinking that King John, what the Americans call us, had a bum rap. It's sort of been treated as a criminal and found guilty without a proper trial, where everybody's biased again, everybody's prejudiced and biased. And it's a very good example of historical bias and how dangerous it is to just accept an account of something without digging deeper. And of course, modern historians do spend years trying to get at the truth. It isn't always possible. It isn't always evidence, or the evidence is so conflicted that it's hard to reach a conclusion. I mean, the book this book that I'm using, written by somebody called Maurice Ashley, who's a very sort of eminent historian, does an awful lot of trying to balance good and bad, and we'll do that next time. We'll do. I've sort of marked it up, so I'll do notes on that when we do Magna Carta. The sort of praise for something good, balanced by, oh, he's made yet another mistake. He made mistakes. He certainly didn't have very good judgment. That doesn't mean, you know, he was being operated like a puppet by the devil, which was what our ancestors came to believe, that he was being operated by the devil. So next time we'll do Magna Carta, the lead up to it and the importance of it, what it actually established, which wasn't quite as much as people think. Certainly not as much as the Americans believe. They got Magna Carta very much up on a pedestal. It wasn't as significant as it's been made to seem in later centuries, but we'll look at Magna Carta, reasons why it came to that the barons had turned against the king, and what Magna Carta actually said. And then we'll finish with John, and then we'll go on to his son, who came to the throne as a child, a 9-year-old, Henry III, when Parliament starts. So you know, big dramatic thing to happen. Finally, democracy.
It's called a cliffhanger, Judy.
Watch this space. Yeah, democracy is on its way.
Thank you very much, Judy. That's another lovely session.
Hope you have a lovely summer, everybody.
And
Stay well.
my apologies for the technical glitch in the middle. I blame Jonathan, but you never know. Thank you, gentlefolk. Have a good summer.
Yes.
We hope to have some good news about another history group starting back in the flesh in September, led by somebody called Stevens. We'll let you know more details about that as soon as it's been finalized. Have a good summer, everyone.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you.
Stay well.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.